Okay, thank you very much, Jay. Let me kick us off with the dismal science of economics, so hopefully your lunch doesn't go down too badly with it. Let me talk a little bit about the nature of the disease and what that means for the value of treating it. Let's see here. There we go. All right. Okay, now let me begin with a few basic clinical facts. And one of them is that, as Jay mentioned, hepatitis C is highly asymptomatic for many years. So it takes quite a long time for the benefits of treatment to accrue. For example, if you compare people who are successfully treated, essentially cured, with no viral load in their bodies, and compare them to other people with hepatitis C who still are infected with the virus, over the first couple of years, there's not a really big difference in death rates among those two populations. But eventually, if you go out 15, 16, 17 years, it turns out that the population that's been cured of hepatitis C, you save about 1 out of every 5 people who would otherwise have died as a result of the disease. I mean, that's an enormous mortality risk that's getting erased, but it takes a substantial amount of time for it to accrue. Now, the same kind of thing is true. This is, of course, very valuable to patients, but the same kind of thing is true from the insurer's perspective when you think about the costs associated with the disease. So think about who ends up with advanced stages of liver disease, which is extremely costly to treat. You might need a liver transplant, you might need various kinds of medical management in order to deal with the complications of scarring of your liver. And the same kind of dynamic applies. If you look at people who are cured versus people who are continue to be infected, you see the same sorts of things. That, for example, when you compare people who are cured to people who are even sort of moderately well treated, when you cure them, you avoid about 1 out of every 12 people getting advanced stages of liver damage. Comparing people who are cured to people who are untreated at all, the number's about 1 out of 6. Okay, so that means that by treating people successfully early in their disease course, you're saving about 1 out of every 6 of them from a very costly set of complications due to scarring of liver. Now, the problem from an economic standpoint is that a lot of the people who are infected with hepatitis C are covered by private insurers or by Medicaid. And neither of those kinds of entities is covering people for very long. So think about this. We've got a disease where the costs of it manifest well into the future, longer than 5 years, really, 10, 15 years down the road. But private payers typically are only covering somebody for about 3 or 4 years. So that creates a significant problem where the payer that has to bear the cost of paying for the treatment doesn't stick around long enough to see the benefits into the future. Now, to understand what's at stake with that problem, let me talk about what the value is of treating people expansively. So compare 2 scenarios. The first, we only treat the sickest patients, which is kind of what we do today. We treat people who are in the more advanced stages of liver damage with novel agents. What would happen if we instead treated everybody who's diagnosed? Now, you think about this in 2. So, of course, I'm not a doctor, and I won't even pretend to be one. But it's sort of intuitive to think about the fact that when you treat people early before their liver has been damaged, it's probably better than treating people late after their liver has already been damaged. And that's, in fact, borne out in the study that we conducted that's published in the American Journal of Managed Care. We found that if you treat everybody who's diagnosed, including people who are in early stages, the total value to society over the next 10 years could be in the order of about $100 billion. Now, that includes all of the lives saved, all of the improvements in health, as well as the changes in medical spending. So if we fail to get the incentives right, and we fail to provide enough incentives for people to make long-term oriented investments in treating people early, there's an enormous amount of social value that we're leaving on the table. And the costs are being borne, first of all, by patients in the form of shorter lives, less healthy lives, but they're also paradoxically being borne by some of the payers who are going to be making these decisions, but yet don't have particularly strong incentives to think about the long term. Now, from the federal government's perspective, this is also an issue for Medicare. And Medicare is in a sort of an uncomfortable position because it doesn't actually cover a lot of people who are in early stages of the disease. most of those people are covered by private payers or by Medicaid. So he doesn't have a lot of control over who gets treated early. But it turns out that if we were to treat hepatitis C patients earlier, that would also save a lot of money for Medicare in the long run, right? About to the tune of about $5 billion over the next 10 years. But the problem for Medicare is they essentially have to rely on the kindness of strangers in order to see those benefits, because they don't control who gets treated early among the younger and non-Medicare eligible populations that are eligible for early stage treatment. Okay, so as an economist, I've been trained not to believe in the kindness of strangers, and I've been trained instead to believe in incentives. So if we think about this problem from that perspective, how can we think about, first of all, what the nature of the incentive problem is and what could we do to address it? I mean, here's the basic issue. That a lot of the people in early stages of illness are currently covered by private payers who won't really get to enjoy the long-term benefits of treating all these patients with a relatively high upfront cost. Okay, these are expensive treatments. Part of it is a sort of an accounting illusion because you're paying for a treatment over a 3-month period that then delivers benefits over 10 or 20 years. If you spread the cost out over that entire patient's lifetime, it's a pretty modest cost, but the financing mechanisms don't work that way. So now we have a private payer that's looking at a big upfront cost, and they're thinking to themselves, well, heck, it's not going to be my problem 10 years down the road. I'm not going to be covering most of these patients 10 years down the road. Someone else is going to be covering them. And moreover, the patients I cover 10 years down the road, their health status is going to be driven by somebody else's decisions. So I'm kind of not really seeing a return on my investment. So what happens then is there's increasing pressure to limit access to patients, and the kind of conventional strategy for doing that is to limit treatment only to people in advanced disease, which ironically, those are the people for whom you can do well, I won't say you can't do good for those patients, but you can do even better if you treat the disease earlier and avoid the liver damage that causes so much complication and mortality. So in the end of it, you see that the true beneficiaries of hepatitis C therapy or early hepatitis C therapy don't really have the means to influence its uptake. And by that I mean the patients who suffer from insufficient access, and also Medicare, which ends up with covering a much sicker population of hepatitis C patients than they could have covered if there were more early stage access. And here's kind of I think one of the central ironies here is that even if you look at only private payers, even they themselves in purely financial terms would recover their costs in terms of avoided medical spending. So think about the following statistics. So we estimated that if you were to go and treat every patient who's diagnosed with hepatitis C, there would be a significant upfront cost, about $80 billion. But if you look into the future and look at all of just the medical costs, forget about the lives saved and the improvements in health, just look at the medical costs that would be saved by those private payers in the long run, they would make their money back in about 15 years. Now, a 15-year time horizon is perfectly acceptable in many private sector industries. For example, the pharmaceutical industry, where it's typical to make an investment in early stage clinical research that doesn't bear fruit for 12 to 18 years. But the problem in the insurance industry is that the insurance companies aren't covering people for a continuous 16-year period. And so they don't get to enjoy the benefits. Now, the policy question then is, how are we going to encourage private insurers to do what is ultimately in the long-term benefit of society, patients, Medicare, and even as a collective, private insurers as a whole? So part of the problem here is, if I'm one private insurer, I'm worried about the fact that my expensive treatment is going to benefit my competitors. So even though as a whole, private insurers are made better off by making the decision to treat everybody, and they as a whole save money in the long term, each individual insurer doesn't have incentive to cover their own patients, because they figure their patients in 16 years are going to be treated by somebody else today. Okay, and you have what economists call a classic free riding problem, that everyone else is pointing fingers at the other private insurer and hoping that they will pay for coverage. So what are there's a much longer discussion here about how to best address the underlying incentive problems to encourage more long-term thinking. But let me just kind of set this up for what I hope is more discussion later. How do we get insurers, provide insurers with incentives to think about the long term. So first of all, it would be useful to think about rewarding private payers who actually make long-term oriented investments. So there's been a lot of interest lately in evaluating or calculating the value of medical technologies, but I think another obvious application of that is, why shouldn't we also evaluate how long-term oriented payers are being in their coverage policies? And if we did that, there would then be a market reward for payers who were leaning more towards protecting the health of their patients for the long run. Another issue that's faced by Medicaid rather than private payers is, as you well know, Medicaid programs are dealing with this problem on a year-to-year basis due to the reality of the way state budgets are allocated. So there is some gain here to figuring out how can we help Medicaid bear the costs of treatment strategies that don't pay off for many years. So how do we provide credit to Medicaid state agencies? How does the industry perhaps think more about smoothed payment schedules? Maybe there's a role for credit extension to state government agencies. And by the way, this isn't just about hepatitis C, because it will ultimately be about all cures for diseases, like gene therapies and other cures that are arriving in the pharmaceutical pipeline, because that's a key property of a cure. There's a high upfront cost where a patient gets this therapy for a relatively short period of time, and then they enjoy the benefits over an entire life. So if we want to be in the position of encouraging cures, I mean, for many years, there's been the joke that the pharmaceutical industry wants drugs that people have to take forever, and they're not interested in curing disease. But the ironic thing is that we have now set up a policy regime that kind of guarantees that outcome, because it doesn't, in fact, provide incentives for cures which have high upfront costs and benefits that accrue over a lifetime. And if we can't solve that problem, then it's hard for me to imagine that we will sustain the level of medical progress we've seen over the past 50 years into the next 50 years. So I'll close with one final point, maybe hopefully inject some optimism into my otherwise gloomy talk, that I think there are ways of solving this problem, fairly straightforward ways. You can imagine just smoothing out the payment over a long period of time. And we do this with our houses, right? If I live in LA. Believe me, I'd not be living in a house if I had to pay for the entire amount of it up front. So we have ways of smoothing payments over time. Part of the issue in the United States is that Medicaid best price rules and other regulations make it very risky and difficult for those kinds of creative pricing schemes to take hold. So one thing we can think, one concrete and practical thing we can think about is, how do we formulate new institutions that allow for more creative pricing schemes that help us match the payments made to the benefits that accrue? So if the benefits are accruing over an entire lifetime, maybe the payments should accrue that way as well, and that's going to require some new thinking about regulation.